Kate here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. Helps me build the channel. My last video interview with William Morris on the RMT strike in the UK was very popular. I got close to 250 views. One of my most popular videos ever. And for everyone who watched my videos could give me a subscription, I appreciate it. I know it's not always easy to do. With Google, you have to log in or have a Google account. I know, but if you can, it helps me build the channel. Regardless, I'm going to keep making videos anyway. Okay, so this video is on the Nazis never really went away. How Nazi Germany, the fascist movement in Britain, in Europe, was not so much defeated, was incorporated after the Second World War, even at the very tail end of it, was incorporated into U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism, NATO, the U.S. security state, the modern West German state. It's a vast series, kind of an introduction to it in some way. So it is known that much of Nazi ideology actually came from the U.S. Eugenics movement was really big in the U.S. in the 1920s, breeding superior people and sterilizing people, weeding out inferior people. This was big in the U.S. And Hitler also admired U.S. Manifest Destiny, how Native Americans were exterminated, America expanded. Hitler kind of admired this. In some ways, he thought he was doing the same thing in the war against Russia, the war against the Soviet Union. He was kind of doing the same thing. There's a Russian movie called White Tiger. I saw it recently. It came out in the early 2000s. It's kind of fantasy about the Second World War. I forget the name of the director. She does films which are kind of a meditation on Russian history. Anyway, in this film, it has the very end of it. Towards the end of it has someone interviewing Adolf Hitler, like a journalist, and Adolf Hitler is saying something like, I know I lost the war, I know it's over, and they're going to write lots and lots of books about what a terrible person I am. They're going to write thousands of books will be written about this, but I'm doing what the West has always wanted to do. I'm just continuing it. There'll be more wars. After me, there'll be others doing this. The war is not going to go away. And in some ways, he's right. I could put it in capitalist terms. This has been a drive, U.S. imperialist drive, like King Leopold, the Belgian Congo, late 19th century, 1880s, killed something like 20 million people. I mean, Western imperialism is drenched in blood, oceans of blood. And Hitler was doing this, saw himself as kind of doing the same thing, only doing it in a later period when it was no longer completely acceptable. Like the character in this movie, White Tiger, says something like, yeah, there'll be some pain and people will be exterminated, there'll be pain, it'll be bad, but it'll heal over quickly and we would resettle with Germans and life would go on. This is what Europe always does. And he's kind of right in some ways. So this is a prefix of sorts to this video. Okay, so it is known large parts of Nazi Germany were incorporated into the West. So what do you mean? So first, there's most famous one is Operation Paperclip, and came into, oh yeah, sorry, I'm skipping over. Okay, history. So when I was in high school, I was fascinated by the collapse of Nazi Germany. I read a zillion different books on it. There's one, The Last 100 Days of Adolf Hitler by John Tolle, and there's a German historian, Joachim Fest, read stuff by him. A couple of those, Marshal Choikov, a Soviet general, he wrote a book on the collapse, end of Nazi Germany. It was really interesting. And I've read a variety of books on this. I was intrigued by the collapsing empire. Hitler was in his bunker, moving around armies which no longer existed and ranting at his generals. He had a couple, and some of the top Nazi leaders thought towards the end of the war that maybe the West would make an alliance with them, like the alliance between the West, like US, Britain especially, and the Soviet Union was not natural. It's not going to last. Tensions were going to develop. And the West is going to realize they're going to need us, and they're going to mobilize Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. And in a way, he was right. In a way, they were right, but it happened too late to do them any good, of course, but in a way, they were right. Okay, so Second World War, Nazis were defeated. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting. They lost something like 27 million people. They overwhelmingly bore the brunt of the fighting. The West kind of stayed out of it until the very end. And the D-Day Normandy was like in 1944. They came in at the very last moment in some ways. Okay, so, and it is known that some of the U.S. generals loved the Nazis, General Patton especially. He had Operation Torch, which invaded North Africa. He often was former French, there were French colonies, and the people ran the French colonial administration were fascists, were the Vichy collaborationists. So what he did is he put these people back, Patton put him back in power. This character, Jean Darlan, I believe he was the collaborationist governor of some, I think it was Morocco. I'm not really sure, but he put them back in power, and there's a lot of public outrage. General Patton thought, oh, they're just efficient, they're good at the job. There's a lot of public outrage, like, weren't we fighting the war to get rid of these people? But so anyway, later on, Patton area in Germany he occupied, there's a concentration camp, and they were processing Jews to leave the camp. Because he kept the Germans in charge of the camp. That was insane. He kept the Germans in charge of the camp, and he kind of admired the Nazis. He would often say that. And he was very anti-Semitic. He hated Jews. And these kind of attitudes were big in some parts of the U.S. military. I know they were the officers, not the enlisted personnel, of course, but the officers. And became a very conservative, top generals came very conservative, right-wing families. It's usually the case. At some level, they kind of thought maybe this is the wrong war. We should be fighting against the communists instead. And this attitude emerged pretty early on, like even a couple months after the war. Okay, so Nazi Germany lost, and some of the top Nazi leaders committed suicide. Hitler, of course, committed suicide. Himmler committed suicide. It's cyanide when he's captured by the British, I believe. Hermann Göring was convicted. He was going to be hung. He took cyanide before he could be hung. A couple other characters. Joseph Goebbels is one of the weirdest characters. First, he apparently early on sort of started off as a Marxist, or like a literary Marxist. He wanted to be a playwright. That stage didn't last very long. And then he became a national bullshit, a follower of Strasser, Gregor Strasser, like the supposedly the left wing of the Nazi party. He was a Strasserite. And then he saw Hitler, went to a Hitler rally or something, and he just like really loved Hitler, being a fanatic Hitlerite after that. Then towards the end of the war, like the Goebbels diaries, the last couple of months of the war, he almost went back to his earlier ideology. He talked about how the bombed cities of Europe, there'll be a new proletarian culture will emerge, a proletarian civilization. This will be final culmination of revolutionary socialism. What? This is Joseph Goebbels saying this, like WTF moment. Anyway, he and his wife committed suicide. Before that, though, they killed their 7 children. He killed, I believe, 7 children. He killed them all. Like, he didn't want them to live in a world which Nazi Germany did not exist. I mean, bizarre character. Martin Bormann, interesting guy. Interesting guy. He was, all these people are utter shit, but he apparently, official story that he died in Berlin in 1945. It's a really interesting book called Aftermath by Ladislas Farrago, a Hungarian writer. I read it in high school. In fact, I read it 3 times. I was fascinated by it. Basically, Bormann, official story is Bormann was killed in Berlin in 1945, but he asserts, and apparently I think it's probably true, that Bormann escaped to South America with a huge amount of money. What I got out of the book, there was this rat line run basically by the Catholic Church, who sympathized with the Nazis, and a huge number of lower level Nazis escaped through South America, went to South America. Nazis, just fascists and fascist collaborators in general, like a huge number of these people, the Catholic Church aided them as these underground networks. And apparently Martin Bormann made it. He lived mostly in Argentina, but other countries in South America. He kept a low profile. He had a lot of money, and he played, like in the 50s, 1950s, maybe early 60s, he played a role in promoting right-wing politics in Latin America. He wasn't really bright enough to be an ideologist. Some of these right-wing figures were looking towards to him, according to this book, looking towards him to provide some guidance. He wasn't really bright enough to be an ideologist, but he did represent his right-wing. He did like this right-wing network in South America. I don't remember when he died, according to the book. I don't remember when he died, but his influence, this later dovetailed with the U.S. security state and the coups late in the 60s and 70s in Latin America, which drew on these same elements. The official story is that Bormann died in 1945, but I suspect there's a reason why it's kind of politically really embarrassing, because he wouldn't be surprised if Martin Bormann, or at least his immediate followers, closely collaborate with the CIA later on. I don't know this for sure. But I wouldn't be surprised at all. Really fascinating history there. So anyway, the Nuremberg trials, some of the top Nazis committed suicide. Nuremberg trials were held in 1946 in the town of Nuremberg, which had been the spiritual center of Nazi Germany. That's why it was held there. At the Nuremberg trials, there were 199 defendants. Of those, 161 were convicted, and 37 were sentenced to death. 37 were sentenced to death. The Cold War was starting pretty early on, like it was full blown by 1948, but there was a lot of tension before that time. There was a lot of tension before that time, like the two, like U.S. and Britain, the allies, France, Britain, U.S. and Soviet Union, had sectors of Germany, had only sectors they were responsible for. Well, the two British and U.S. area were merged. There's bizonal, and then later the French section was added as trizonal. That became West Germany, and there was a quickly beginning of a falling out between the U.S., mostly West dominated by the U.S., and then on the Soviet Union, there was a Berlin blockade and all that stuff, and there was a currency reform in the Western section. This way really would hurt the Eastern section. The Soviet Union established what became East Germany. Okay, whole other story. But while that was happening, the Nuremberg trials were they were very important precedent, very valuable stuff, and really important. And they were kind of at the end kind of wound down, they weren't publicized at the time to the German population. Like, seriously, they didn't know about it. They weren't taught initially about these horrific crimes that their leaders had committed just a few years earlier. They wanted to kind of lowball it. And there was a large public sentiment to end like, let's get our guys back, get these war criminals out of prison. Their crimes were minimized among the German population. There's sentiment to wind this thing down. So after Nuremberg trials, some of the lower level Nazi leaders they were sent to local German courts a few years later, and they were almost entirely let go, basically, and went out the back door, let go, reintegrate. And they were told, the sentiment in Germany was, let's forget this whole thing. Let's go back to normal and just forget this whole thing. There was a widespread sentiment. So it was kind of wound down, lowballed in some ways. Okay, well, Nuremberg itself was some very important stuff. So it was known, a couple of things went on here. So it was Operation Paperclip. Something like 1,600 Nazi scientists, top-level Nazi scientists, were brought to the U.S. These were Nazis. They weren't like passive Nazis who just joined the Nazi party. And there's a myth that the U.S. got the good Nazis. That's not true. These people were quite vicious. Almost all of them were vicious war criminals. They were advisors or friends with the very top leaders. Some of these people were extremely sadistic, carried out human experiments, and they were thought they would possibly be valuable to the United States, and they were brought over. What we know about this came from mostly two journalists. First, Linda Hunt. In 1985, she got information on this from FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. You can get previously classified information from the U.S. government. So she got it from a FOIA request from, I guess, the Department of Defense. They sent her a check for a bill for $125,000 Xeroxing fees, like a way of punishing her. I don't know how she dealt with it or what happened. That was before today. We have crowdfunding. I assume she raised money to pay it off. I don't know what happened. It was a way of discouraging her or punishing people who do this kind of research. So Linda Hunt's book is called Secret Agenda: The Untold Story of the United States Government, Nazi Scientists, and Project Paperclip, 1945 to 1990. And the book, I believe it came out in 1991. It was a bombshell. It revealed a lot of this. Linda Hunt herself, I don't know much about her. She's kind of a low-profile journalist. She's still around, but kind of a low-profile journalist. Another journalist, more high-profile, was known for this, is Annie Jacobsen. She did a lot of research. She wrote a book which came out in 2014, and I believe Annie Jacobsen's first book was on Area 51, a secret CIA testing site in Nevada. A lot of murky stuff has been going on down there. She's not she doesn't believe in UFOs. She kind of disagrees with the UFO narratives that they're secretly hiding aliens in Area 51. She thinks this whole UFO narrative and the US UFO mythology, CIA disinformation. She's been on Joe Rogan, had a really interesting discussion of it. Anyway, her book on Operation Paperclip came out in 2014, and it's called Operation Paperclip: The Secret Intelligence Program That Brought Nazi Scientists to America. I haven't read either book, to be really honest. People say who read both books say that Annie Jacobsen kind of whitewashes it to some extent. And her book was praised by the CIA, so I don't know. This is information that they want people. I don't know, but supposedly Linda Hunt's book is more hard hitting, but I haven't seen either one. I haven't read either one. What Annie Jacobsen says is pretty mind blowing. Anyway, okay, Operation Paperclip. It began in what became Operation Paperclip began in 1946. Something like 1,600 Nazi scientists were brought to the U.S. It began in 1946 in the castle. We have Kronsberg Castle, I think it's in southern Germany. All these scientists were assembled there, and they had a U.S. Army had brought over people to interrogate them. And some of these interrogators were horrified that these scientists were going to be brought to the U.S. They were like, war criminals, we can't do this. And there was a lot of pushback. So what they did is they renamed the program. It was called Operation Paperclip because the documents about it, they had other documents to hide it, were paper clipped onto it. So it's Operation Paperclip is with hiding what they were really doing. So these scientists were interrogated and brought to the U.S. And most famous is the NASA space scientist, Werner von Braun, a bunch of other people. Okay, so the most famous Operation Paperclip scientists are Werner von Braun and a group around him who worked on the U.S. space program, the Apollo program, which landed on the moon. They're usually shown as the good Nazis. They're the good. Well, first, it's not well known, but Werner von Braun himself was in the Waffen-SS, was a combat division of the SS. So were large numbers of scientists. Werner von Braun, basically, he was working a slave labor project. Nordhausen underground complex was V2 missiles were built. And every morning, I think it was every morning, he would pick out, von Braun himself would personally pick out slaves. He'd send them to a camp and pick out who he wanted for the slaves for that day. Slaves were routinely worked to death. It was horrific conditions. I don't know how often this happened, but like the 5 slowest Jews would be shot. I think it was every morning, keep the people terrorized and work them to death. Anybody suspected of sabotage would be hung from a crane. There was von Brunner's most famous one. Arthur Rudolph, who supervised the project. He was an extremely vicious character. People shot left and right. He was brought over. These people, and there were a variety of other people worked on the V2 program who were pretty horrific characters. They were brought to the U.S., given U.S. citizenship, given a lot of honor, got a lot of publicity in the media. There was some controversy. Most part, everybody was okay with it. Now, the question is, was it necessary? U.S. Americans couldn't really get a rocket up in the air. Seriously, there was in the 50s the White Sands testing program in New Mexico, and missile after missile would explode on the launch pad. I'm not saying I support any U.S. military. I don't, but I'm just saying Americans couldn't get a rocket up in the air, missile after missile. Finally, when they put the Germans in charge, that's when the missiles started working. Rockets, they were able to get a rocket in the air. It's like Elon Musk today, also rockets just explode on a launch pad, that they don't work. So people compare this though to the Soviet space program, which was mostly ahead of the US. They were working from a lower level, but they were ahead. Basically, the US, they were working on a prototype of the V2 missile. They brought over, they got some Nazi scientists. We don't know how many. We don't know how many the Soviet Union got, but Soviet Union, they brought them to the Soviet Union. They didn't like these people. They hated them. They kept them. They didn't treat them very well. But they pumped them for information. And then they sent them back to Germany, usually West Germany. The CIA would interrogate them afterwards and ask them, what they knew. They knew nothing about the Soviet space program because they weren't allowed to see it. They were just kept really isolated and pumped for information. So And the Russians or Soviets were able to get a more like advanced space program. They got the first satellite Sputnik in here. They had the first dog in space, Laika. They had the first human in space, and so on. They discontinued their space program at a certain time, using bureaucratic stuff. There was the moon race, famous moon race. They didn't discontinue the space program, but they discontinued the moon race thing. But they were slow and steady, but far ahead of the U.S. Could the U.S. have done that model without bringing all the Nazi scientists over? It's an interesting question, and it's an interesting debate. Also, this rocket scientist, Kurt Dubois, I believe his name was. He was brought over as one. He was a vicious Nazi. But today there's a NASA award named after Kurt Dubois. He still has an honored place. Interesting story. Annie Jacobson talks about this guy, Walter Schreiber, who apparently was the equivalent of the Nazi Surgeon General. He was one of the people in charge of health. He was an expert in vaccinology and medicine. He was a really world-renowned scientist. He was a prominent scientist and developed medical techniques. He was also a pretty vicious criminal. He would literally personally do human experiments, like cut up people, horrific experiments on people while they're alive, living people while somebody's not anesthetized, things like that. Pretty horrific guy. And Hitler really liked him. He was close to Hitler, got some award. I believe it was him. He got an award, like $1 million Reichsmarks from Hitler, and he gave him a nice house. So he was part of this Operation Paperclip. They brought him to the United States. Oh, in the Nuremberg, he had went on the Nuremberg trial, and he was in trial. One of the man who had been experimented, one of his victims who had been experimented on, like stuck in a knife and attacked him when he was on trial. So the judge had the attacker himself, who had been really highly traumatized, had the attacker arrested in the same prison as the Nazis. I don't know how long the guy was there, probably not as long. Anyway, Schreiber was sprung out of jail basically by the U.S. He was brought to the U.S. He was a convicted Nuremberg criminal. He was brought to the U.S. and I don't know what they did with him, but he wasn't in the U.S. that long. What happened? Maybe a Boston Globe journalist exposed what he did, and there's something of a public uproar, and they got rid of him. He basically sent him to Argentina, and he lived out his life there. But he was the Nazi Surgeon General. There's another character named Dr. Blum. I didn't get his first name. Dr. Blum was the assistant Surgeon General. These two guys, Schreiber and Blum, hated each other. There's like a rivalry in Nazi Germany. Hitler would encourage his subordinates to clash with each other. The big part of Nazi Germany. And Blum was also a vicious war criminal. He came to the U.S., had a great career. I'm not sure exactly what he did. He worked for the National Institute of Health and a variety of other things. And these people were believed to have expertise that was very useful. Interesting, Annie Jacobson met Walter Blum's son, who's actually a doctor and lives in some cottage in the Black Forest, and met with him. They had a very moving account. Annie Jacobson had done tons of research, shared what she knew about this Blum, and Blum's son shared his knowing. And Blum's son felt really guilty about it and wasn't happy. I think Annie Jacobson tried to meet up with Schreiber's son, or one of his sons, and it didn't go so well. I don't meet with you. I'm going to call the police. And he was pretty hostile. But some interesting story. There's another guy, and I don't know if Annie Jacobson talked about him. I assume she did, but I haven't read her book. Eric Traub, who was the head. He was brought to the U.S. part of Operation Paperclip. He was the head of the Nazi bacteriological warfare research effort. What he was doing is researching using bacteriological warfare on the Soviet Union. And according to the Stalker Zone, which is a Russian site in English, it asserts that Nazi Germany did use a bacteriological warfare, like at Stalingrad and elsewhere. I don't know enough about it to say. I wouldn't be surprised. But anyway, this Eric Traub was in charge of this project, studying how to infect the Soviet Union from Germany with dangerous pathogens. He was brought to the U.S. He played a prominent role, but very murky. We don't know what he did. I've discussed him in an earlier video. I don't know. I got to be careful what I say, and I don't know what YouTube is going to allow. But following the situation in Ukraine, there are strong allegations. The U.S. has between 20 and 30 biowarfare labs in Ukraine, and there's a Bulgarian independent journalist who asserts that U.S. has something like 230 bacteriological warfare labs surrounding Russia and China. Scott Ritter points out it's a legal gray area, like legal, like it's against banned by the Geneva Convention, but U.S. has allowed this research and allowed some of this in research for research purposes. It's a legal gray area, but it's kind of known the U.S. is doing this, and the Russian Ministry of Defense accuses the U.S. says the U.S. has already done this, infected cattle herds in Russia, and experimented with people in people in a psychiatric hospital in Ukraine. Is the Cuban government is known the U.S. did this in Cuba in the 60s. The Cuban government says this, and some of the stuff came out in the church committee hearings. So I don't know what extent Eric Traub and this line of research from Nazi Germany, how much of it was transferred to the U.S. and just continued stuff. I don't know. I can't say I definitely know. It take a huge amount of research, but it'll be interesting in covering some of this. So it is known, there's something called Operation Gladio, post-war effort in Europe in many countries in Europe by the CIA, which was supposed to be like a stay-at-home army in case you expected the Russians, the Soviets would invade Western Europe, like a stay-at-home army. Its roots and later on became an offensive right-wing armies, very murky, and it has Nazi fascist roots. The people who were, of course, most anti-communist were the defeated Nazis and fascists. So they were recruited. Now, in the last days of Nazi Germany, there's something called Operation Werewolf. And it's very murky. We don't even know a lot about it, but there were supposed to be like groups of young people, like a Nazi resistance army, like they were going to assassinate Germans who would cooperate with the Allies. They morphed into that. I believe they assassinated the mayor of Cologne. And they were mostly strong against the Russians. They were targeted against the communists and assassinate anybody who cooperated with the communists in the Russian and the Soviet zone. Something like the Soviets cracked down on them. Something like 5,000 of the werewolf people who were killed. The details are very murky. We don't know a lot about what happened, but we do know what happened. And there may have been some continuity. I don't know this for sure, but it's likely there was some continuity between this Operation Werewolf group and later right-wing efforts supported by the CIA. And I don't know this for sure, but there was something called the BDJ. The BDJ was started in 1949. Germany at this time was officially demilitarized. They weren't allowed to have an army. Germany was remilitarized, like West German Army was founded in 1955. That was a very controversial decision, but before the time they weren't allowed to have an army. So there's a group called the BDJ, I believe it was Bundesdeutschjungen, the League of German Youth. They were planned to be a 40,000 man army. I don't know how much they got off the ground, but it was a small right-wing private army. They were recruited from former Wehrmacht, former SS, former Nazi elements. The idea was supposed to be a resistance army if the communists invaded. It was the BDG, and they seemed to have been a predecessor of early groups. They were shut down. Someone like a local journalist found out about them, alerted the Frankfurt police. Frankfurt, Germany was their headquarters, and they were shut down. A predecessor group early on, pretty early on, was the Kampfgruppen gegen Untermenschlichkeit, which means the fighting group against inhumanity or against degeneracies or something like that. They were, I think, 46, 47. They were former Nazis. They were kind of the predecessors of BDJ. Both these groups were paid for by the CIA. The CIA subsidized both these groups. The BDJ, they had plans to assassinate at least 40 people, SDPs, the Social Democratic Party, assassinate 40 SDP politicians. The plot was foiled. I'm not sure what happened to the people involved, but it was broken up. So this may have been a predecessor of later groups. Okay, so it is known that two people involved in this BDJ were two Wehrmacht officers, high-ranking officers. I don't know if they were top generals, but they're Speidel and Adolf Heusinger. And they later played roles in the later West German Bundeswehr. They were leaders in this BDJ movement. In 2014, Der Spiegel magazine, this is a German magazine, they they got evidence that more evidence about some of these murky immediate post-war murky right-wing groups. They got some evidence which kind of referred to the BDG. I'll provide a link to it. It's kind of interesting, but there's a lot going on that we still don't know about. But all this was sponsored by the CIA, basically, it's Nazi revival group. Okay, so it was Operation Gladio, and definitive book on it is by a Swiss historian, Daniel Ganser. It's NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio, and Terrorism in Western Europe. It came out in 2004. Daniel Ganser seems to be activist in the anti-war movement for years. There's been pushback, definitive book on Operation Gladio. Again, I haven't read it, to be really honest. But there was pushback on it. People say, well, he got his information from Russian sources, Soviet disinformation, standard trope. I kind of think he's absolutely accurate. Anyway, this Operation Gladio was very, very murky. There's a lot going on. It's very, very complicated and very, very murky. Basically, there's a network. They were in like a lot of countries, almost every country of Western Europe. They got a lot of aid from Franco's Spain, actually. They were supposed to be stay-at-home armies. They were in Germany, West Germany, France, Belgium, Finland, the Netherlands, Italy, so many, Turkey, so many other places, most of which, became NATO countries. NATO was founded in 1949. They were supposed to be a stay-at-home army in case the Russians invaded, but they quickly morphed into something else. They were fascist, largely fascist, or far right wing. And they were also like this BDG group in Germany. They were suspected they were not so much fighting the Russians, but they were right wing in their own, moving their own country, own societies to the right. This Operation Gladio became offensive. There was a lot of murky stuff. There was the Bologna bombing in 1980. Train station Bologna, Italy was bombed. 85 people were killed. It was blamed on the left, but it was pretty likely carried out by Operation Gladio. A lot of this started coming to light in 1991, where Prime Minister of Italy, then Giulio Andreotti, there was a very complicated corruption scandal, and he mentioned it in Parliament. He first this Operation Gladio, what's going on, mentioned in Parliament. Now, some of the background, like Germany and Italy had a huge left wing at the time. They operated differently in Italy. There was disillusionment with the Italian Communist Party, which was huge and came very close to taking power several times. In the US, CIA wanted to avoid this at all costs. Italy was a NATO country, wanted to avoid this. The Italian Communist Party itself was largely reformist. They were adopting Euro communism. They were type of reformist. But anyway, the idea was to discredit the left. There's what they called the strategy of tension, to whip up a lot of conflict on society so people would look to the right, to an authoritarian leader to stop the conflict. And there was a group in Italy, the Red Brigades, Brigati Rossi, and they were a big thing. They were carried out. They did a lot of kneecapping, so much kill people but shoot people in kneecaps. It wasn't a productive method. A lot of this wasn't really activism, wasn't working class oriented. But anyway, the idea is the strategy of tension was meant to discredit the left, to whip up a lot of conflict, like the Bologna bombing. 85 people were killed. It was blamed on the left and was used to defuse this huge. Northern Italy has huge left wing, huge, went in different directions, maybe not the most productive directions, but it was huge. The idea to discredit this. Germany, kind of a similar thing happened. The Baader-Meinhof group. And there was a huge left wing in Germany. Unfortunately, it didn't really go anywhere. It grew out of opposition to the Vietnam War and a bunch of other things. So strategy of tension, like it's believed the Red Brigades, they kidnapped a former prime minister, Aldo Moro, and killed him, I think in 1979-80. That was believed to really been carried out by Operation Gladio infiltrators in the Red Brigades. And some of this is very complicated and very murky. It is known Operation Gladio operated in Turkey and in Greece. There was like, they what called the strategy of tension was in Turkey. They definitely tried to increase conflict between the left and the right to support the right ultimately. I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty certain this is going on in the contemporary U.S. right now. They're like, it is not like the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. She was a flashpoint in the culture war. We had really strict COVID lockdowns, and she was opposed by the right wing. So there's a plot. The FBI supposedly foiled this plot to kidnap her, and this whole plot terrified a lot of liberals. And we're going to have a fascist takeover. I know people on Facebook were like terrified by this. Well, it turned out this plot was set up it was entirely set up by the FBI, entirely FBI entrapment. Glenn Greenwald has a masterful dissection. This doesn't mean I sympathize with the right wing. No, I don't sympathize. I wouldn't kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. No, it's not that. But the fact this thing was set up by the FBI. The FBI did this shit all the time during the Bush administration. They foil these. They started these entrapment operations. Get these like some alienated Muslim immigrants or leftists, and bring them in these tourist plots, and then foil the plot and show how great the FBI is. They're stopping all this Muslim or left-wing terrorism. Yay for the FBI. They do this stuff pretty much all the time. More recently, there's a case in Idaho where some fascist group was apparently going to disrupt an LGBT pride march. And it looked like they were feds. The whole thing was feds. And come on, the whole thing. So I could go on. I mentioned my opinion about the Capitol riot. They have hearings going on. NPR still calls it the insurrection. I my feelings about that. I think I can't prove anything. And people accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist. They do that anyway. But I think there's some strategy of tension shit going on. They basically, the ruling class didn't want Trump. I don't like Trump. I despise Trump. I don't like Trump. I have no support for Trump. But the ruling class or sections of it didn't like Trump either for different reasons. That it was too destabilizing. They wanted to head that off. Much of the security state apparatus, they were around the Republicans and the right wing. Now they've gone towards the Democrats, to quote left wing. It's really fascinating cultural thing. Max Blumenthal had a really interesting interview with someone. I'll provide a link to it. There's some of the stuff going on. Okay, anyway, so Operation Gladio had fascist roots. It was a CIA, U.S. security state project, had fascist roots. It's very complicated and very murky. Another big way fascism survived in the West German legal. Well, first West German chancellor, post-war chancellor, was Konrad Adenauer. He was known to be, he kind of clean. He was not a Nazi, not an ex-Nazi. He was, I believe he was Catholic. He was mayor of Cologne for a while in the 1920s. He was apparently involved in the French separatist plot to get that region to secede from Germany, French-backed secessionist plot, and he was criticized for that. I think he had to resign, but anyway, he was elected Chancellor of Germany. He was regarded as an honorable figure. Very anti-Nazi and everything with Nazis, but his chief of staff was a guy known as Hans Glubke. And he was very close to Hans Glubke, and Hans Glubke kind of ran Germany in some ways, played a huge role in building post-war West Germany. Well, Hans Glubke was one of the people who wrote the Nuremberg race laws, like discriminating against Jews. Hans Glubke's idea to have all Jews add their name like Abraham or Sarah to their name to identify them as Jews, stereotypical Jewish names. So he was in charge. He's a pretty nasty character. There was a little, I don't know what public opinion said during that time, but he played a huge role. Hans Glubke brought Nazis into the German security state, into the military, into the security state. There was something like 86 Wehrmacht generals who ended up as NATO generals. I mean, this guy, Admiral Dönitz, who was the last Führer of Germany, he was head of the German Navy, and Hitler was going to say bye-bye. So he appointed Dönitz to succeed him. And Dönitz ran this like Nazi government like for a week or 2 weeks after Hitler committed suicide in the town of Flensburg, Germany. And really trippy story. They spent like a week writing bizarre memos to each other. The British finally arrested them. Anyway, Dönitz got 10 years in jail. He, all Nazis are scum, but he was just relatively clean. I don't think he was a major war criminal, as far as I know. The army kind of, the Navy, German Navy kind of stayed out of politics. So anyway, he got 10 years in jail, and he was pissed off at Hitler for making him last fewer because all his other friends were having great NATO careers. He was pissed off at Hitler because it ruined his chance of having a NATO career. It's kind of weird. Anyway, so as Hans Glubke pointed, he played a huge role in bringing ex-Nazis into the West German state. This guy named Reinhard Gehlen, the Gehlen organization, which was a huge spy apparatus, intelligence apparatus, was part of Nazi Germany. The whole organization was transferred intact to West Germany. They became anti-communist. These former Nazis just became fanatic anti-communists, transferred it over. But the Gehlen organization continued intact well into the 1960s. It was disbanded at some point. There was a public outcry. Also, a huge number of the West German legal system was run by Nazis. Something like 70% of the German legal system, of German jurists, like lawyers, judges, whole people working in the legal apparatus were Nazi party members. And some of these people were quite nasty Nazis. They weren't just passive, they were quite nasty. They were death warrants, and they were quite nasty criminals. They were transferred intact into the West German legal system. It was kind of really interesting. Okay, so there was this in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. I'm from Vermont. It was a bit before my time, but late 70s, there was a Christine Burster case. She was a West German radical, came from Hamburg, I believe. She was involved in the radical therapy movement, like a socialist therapy group collective in Frankfurt. There was a huge left-wing upsurge in Germany at the time. She was maybe sympathetic. There's a group called the Baader-Meinhof group, often called Baader-Meinhof Gang. They were a terrorist group. I don't support them. They were some really stupid stuff. There's a fascinating movie called the Baader-Meinhof Collective, which is the Baader-Meinhof Complex, which is really fascinating to watch. I think their tactics were just totally wrong. But anyway, there was a lot of sympathies. Kirsten Burster may have had some sympathy for them. We don't know. And she doesn't appear guilty of anything, but she thought the German cops were after her, that they had her tagged for something. She was a radical psychiatrist or anti-psychiatrist, follower of Thomas Saz, who was really big in the 60s and 70s, radical psychotherapy movement. Okay, anyway, Christine Burster, whole story, I believe she went to Canada on a tourist visa, and she was crossing the border legally into Vermont. She was arrested, and there was a big diplomatic tug of war. She applied for diplomatic asylum to the United States. I think it wasn't granted. The German government was after her for no one knew why, some undisclosed reason. And people at the time said, this was Nazi survival in West Germany. The West German state was very anti-leftist. The legal system, anyway, really vicious crackdown on these leftists. There's known the German diplomat corps went out of its way to protect German Nazis in South America or elsewhere. They protected. All this network comes from the Hans Globke's networks to protect these people. So there was a very large fascist element in the West German state. People talk about Fourth Reich. There was maybe exaggerating somewhat, like West Germany was not like Nazi Germany, but there were definite survivals and a deep authoritarian streak in Germany, even to this day. There's the journalist Anita Lipp, I believe her name is. She's a German citizen, part German, part Russian, but she's a German citizen. She's working in the Donbass region of Ukraine where there's fighting going on. And she's reporting, she says she's not pro-Russian, she's reporting just what people say. Interviewing like Patrick Lancaster, kind of does the same sort of thing, just seeing what people say. And the German government, she was accused of like echoing Russian propaganda. Russian disinformation. She get 3 years in jail for this. This is kind of insane. So there's some deep authoritarian trends in German society. I'll tell you, years ago, I worked in Germany. I worked for a U.S. Army hotel. I hated it, but and Garm is the only job I could find in Europe at the time. It was in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, ski resort south of Munich. It was built by the Nazis. They have a dorm. These kids like about youngish, or sometimes not so young, backpackers who work in there. This dormitory where everybody lived. It was sort of like college in a way, only a bit more in the dormitory where everyone lived. And the dormitory was originally built in the shape of swastika. One wing was torn down so it wouldn't look like swastika. It was originally a Nazi hospital, like people from the Eastern Front would be brought there. Okay, so now it's a Garmisch-Partenkirchen. It had been a ski resort built by the Nazis, actually. And I worked for this hotel, the Von Steuben Hotel, clean rooms and stuff. I hated the job. I was there for 7 months. But anyway, my parents came to visit me. They wouldn't visit me when I was in China or Russia or other places. They were really scared, and I had better jobs then. But they didn't want to visit me. But they did visit me in Germany. It was a Western country. Anyway, my dad stayed at this hotel. It was like part of this tourist group my parents signed up for, and like for German American tourists. I'm mostly German ancestry. I don't hate German people, but I live in Germany. I didn't like it there, but so this German American group, my dad was kind of in, and there's tourist package. So they'd stay at this hotel, which was run by this tourist group. My dad said, they're keeping notes on us. They know exactly what we're doing. My dad picked up the stuff. They have guards watching. They have video cameras, and they keep close ties on what people are doing at some level. Germany is still very much of a controlled society, so it does have this element. And so anyway, this video was a bit disjointed. I wanted to mention another thing. I wanted to mention the Croatians, the Ustashi, Croatian fascist group. They made it. They immigrated to Bolivia, and they're still there. They played a role in the coup a couple of years ago against the right-wing coup. So there's elements still there, and there are all kinds of murky connections we don't really fully know about yet. Okay, I hope you enjoyed my videos. It was a little disjointed, and I have a bunch of things going on. I thought my dog yesterday morning broke his leg, and I tried to take him to an emergency clinic, like an emergency pet clinic. So I was waiting there for 2 hours in my car, really hot, waiting in my car. You can't go in because of COVID. So they keep everybody waiting in their cars. My AC didn't work very well. So I was there for 2 hours. I called them, said, how much longer do you think it's going to take? Oh, probably another 3 or 4 hours. Forget this. So I came back home, tried to look up a vet, and no vets. You can book an appointment like a month in advance. They're all booked. So I found out about this other place I live in Portland, Maine, other place, which you can book an appointment online, which I did, 5:30. So I got there at 5:30. Well, we're really slammed. We have to wait a little bit. So I was there for 3 hours, and again, in my car. They took my dog and were examining Max, but they had him for like, I think I waited for about an hour. I waited for like, I think it was like an hour and a half. They took Max finally. I was waiting for another hour and a half. Well, we have to do an exam. We'll be finished in 20 minutes. So I had to wait an hour and a half. I don't like driving in the dark. I had to drive home at night. And finally, my dog was okay, totally okay. But oh God, that was a mess. So anyway, I didn't have time to put into much time to put in this video as I would have liked. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you. Bye-bye.